Something my painting company comes across often is we go to a potential client's house and all of their baseboards are a stained wood. And a lot of the trim throughout the house is a stained wood, and they're wanting us to make that a paint. And usually that's a pretty labor intensive job that is pretty expensive relative to just painting. And the reason for that is our typical process is we'll sand the previously stained wood, put a primer on, and then a couple coats of paint. Whereas if it was just regular baseboards that are previously painted, we could just paint those. So it's quite a big difference. And I've always wondered, what is the best primer I could use for this use case, just to ensure I'm getting the best bond possible. And then I also was curious, what kind of a difference does it make by sanding it versus not sanding it? Because I do know firsthand, if you paint a glossy surface that had like a lacquer or polyurethane on there and you just paint it and you don't do any prep, you can come back a month, even a year later, and scrape that paint off with your fingernail. I also know that if you use, cheaper primers that I've used in the past, I have the same result, just like paint, to where I can scrape it off. So I went to Sherwin Williams, Benjamin Moore, PPG, and Home Depot and just asked, hey, what is the best primer for this application and use? And something that I found surprising, just from being a painter over the years, I've heard different opinions like, oh, you got to use an oil-based primer, or maybe even some solvent-based like an alcohol-based primer, or these specialty primers if you want to have a good bond for these kind of application uses. And at least at the time that I went to the store and spoke with the paint reps, it seemed like, today, a lot of times we can actually use water-based, which is, in my personal opinion, preferred. Just, other types of primers, they smell a lot worse, have more VOCs, they're a lot harder to clean up, whether that be your brush or if you're, use a sprayer. It just can be a hassle to use those. So if you can use a good water-based product, it's always easier, in my opinion, and better to use that. But if that's not going to be a good application and not going to, achieve the results that we're looking for, then I understand not using that. So my point is, I got all water-based primers, which was excellent to know that, according to these manufacturers, today at least, these primers are high-end and will do the job necessary. So I'll just show you some of the primers I tested. I did this seal grip from PPG. I don't know if it's exactly a Benjamin Moore product, but it was sold at the store. It's Sticks. It's a pretty popular primer I've seen a lot of other painters use and stuff. Sherwin Williams Extreme Bond Primer. And then from Home Depot, this Behr, just called Bonding Primer. And if you look at the descriptions, they'll say, glass, tile, glossy wood finishes, like things that are really hard to get a bond. That's what these primers are designed for. All right, so the experiment I did was, we got some of these, typical 90s home, cabinets that you'll see. What's really similar to what, baseboard trim would look like on a 90s home, where we just see a lot of clients transitioning their home from that older, stained wood look to a newer, painted look. And what I tried was a bunch of different things. One thing we did was no sanding, and then we did a light sand, like a scuff sand, and then like a full sand. And then I let this sit for a full 38 days. I wanted to make sure I had plenty of time to cure, because I do know from experience that sometimes if you let something sit for a month or even longer, that its properties change a bit and it's able to form a little bit stronger of a bond. And then I also tested out, here you can see where I just gave it 24 hours to dry to see what kind of difference that made. So I tested out different primers. I even tested some lower end primers just for fun to see if I could tell a difference between, a specialty expensive bonding primer versus your run of the mill generic multi-purpose primer. And I did notice a difference there, which is nice to see. And then I also took my top 3 primers and painted this chair, which just has a super high gloss on it. And I knew it'd be a little bit harder to stick to than these cabinet doors over here. And I'll show you some of my results of me actually taking a scraper and scraping these, pretty rough, and using my fingernail to try to scrape off the primer. But also, just if you want to not see all that, just kind of share the results I found, which to me was extremely surprising. My hypothesis, what I thought was going to happen, didn't necessarily happen. I thought for sure if you didn't sand it, it would just come right off easily. And I was astonished to find that what we didn't sand actually stuck. Now, I will admit, if you want to watch when I'm actually scraping, it's not as big of a difference as I thought, but if you sand, it's definitely a better bond. And I'm not saying don't sand, you know, do whatever makes the most sense for you, but I was just surprised that it wasn't as big of a difference as I originally thought in my head from sanding versus not sanding. And I did notice with like a lower end primer like this Kills that it was quite a big difference from where I sanded versus where I didn't sand, versus like the Extreme Bond primer from Sherwin Williams. It was very, very, very little difference from where I sanded to where I didn't sand. I'm guessing there was less gloss on this side than here, because even though this wasn't sanded, the paint is sticking better on this side here than it did over here. And it definitely seems to be sticking best where we really sanded it over here. All right, so that's Sherwin Williams Extreme Bond primer. One other note I will make is that the tannins from the wood, that yellow color, it did come through well on here. So it obviously did a great job bonding, which you'd think Extreme Bond primer, that's its main purpose. In terms of a stain blocker primer, I wouldn't say it was the best. We'll compare the others, but it did a great job of making things stick. Even where I didn't sand, you can see I can't really scrape that off, which is way better than what I was expecting. Let's try the sticks. All right, some notes. Did best on the full sand for sure. I would say I didn't really notice much of a difference between these two. Again, I'm shocked where we didn't sand. It stuck phenomenally. I mean, if you tried to scrape it off with your fingernail, I can't really get it to come off. Where I know some of these paints we test will just come right off, or at least I suspect they will. All right, seal grip. This did a really good job. They're acting pretty similar. What I'm mainly blown away by is that how well it sticks where we didn't sand. I'm gonna do another test at the end with my fingernail, because I think if I go against the grain I can get it off, but all the primers have performed really well. Again, another Behr primer, and it is leaving scuff marks, which the other primers do not do. A very popular primer, Kills. You can tell either Brian put it on thin or it's just a lot thinner of a primer, because we didn't get good coverage there. All right, so I was actually to scrape off some with the Kills. I believe this is the cheapest primer I tested, so it's nice to see that if you pay up for a primer, it does seem like you're getting more quality. It stuck well where we sanded. Where we didn't sand, I was able to get some up, which is interesting and good to know. All right, so the results I found was that these two primers perform the best for this specific, experiment and application. Extreme Bond primer from Sherwin Williams and just bonding primer from Behr. They did exceptionally well. A close third was this Sticks primer, but I could definitely tell that these two formed a stronger bond, not only on the 30-day-old or 38-day-old, but also on the 24 hours. This is a urethane based, and I could feel that with my fingernail trying to scrape it off. It was a slicker, smoother surface and harder to create some bite on my fingernail. But as you can see, like, I didn't sand any of this, and I have a really hard time scraping it off. I really cannot get this primer to come off of this super high gloss finish. So yeah, the point I'm making is, at least when you use high-end primers like these two right here, I think one could argue, especially if you're a homeowner, if you want top quality and you're a painting company, I totally get sand it. That's the right way to do it. That's the way I've been taught. That's the way I've always done it. But do the experiment, try it out, try not sanding it and see what a difference it makes. At least for the two things that I painted, it didn't really make a difference. And for me, if I were to be doing it myself or paying for it, I really wouldn't want to pay for the cost of the manual labor to go through and sand everything if it's not going to make a difference. And you can see from the results of me scraping, it didn't really make a difference, at least with these primers. Now, just for fun too, I also just painted this wood with just some high-end paints like Emerald, Aura, Manor Hall, and Marquee. And you could tell right away, if you don't prime it, I could scrape all of those off. I was surprised it stuck fairly decently, but if you didn't sand and you just painted on there, you can scrape it off with your fingernail. But with the primers and no sanding, I couldn't. At least with those two, you know, the Kills, you could definitely get that to come off. But with the Extreme Bond primer and the bonding primer, you could argue almost no difference from where you sanded to where you didn't sand, which again was just an astonishment and surprise to me. So please let me know in the comments if you want me to test some other things, like maybe painting some plastic or some other hard to stick to surface, or just any other experiments you'd like me to run. If I'm genuinely interested and curious about it like I was with this, I will try to find the time to do it.